Welcome to part 3 in a series of videos that I'm creating to show you how to use ReactJS with GraphQL and TypeScript and some other tools to help you easily build applications and make you more productive. In the first part, I set up a GraphQL server using Apollo GraphQL and showed you how you can use Next to help you get data out of the database, and then the Apollo GraphQL server to serve up your clients and make building GraphQL servers really easy. In part 2, I went on to show you how to create a React application, integrate with the Apollo GraphQL client library and the code generator tool, and how you can bring those together with hooks to make it really easy to put things onto a screen. In part 3, we're going to take it to the next step, and we're going to introduce Formik, which is a really simple to use form library, and the React router tools, so that you can not only see the to-dos from your to-do list that you created so far, but you can then go in and edit one of the to-dos. So let me kind of break down how we're going to tackle this. If you look on the screen, you can see a form where we've got some simple text boxes. We have a drop down as well that lets us kind of pick which project we're getting things from, and a checkbox and some buttons. If you look at the URL, you can also see that we've added routing in there to take you to that edit screen. What we're going to do is going to start off by taking the code that we created in the previous version and add routing to it. Once we have some routing in there so we can move between screens, then we'll take a look at the form itself and we'll create components for each of those different form elements there. And once we've done that, we'll then introduce Formik and show you how Formik can handle managing your form state and handle when you want to submit a form and carry out any validation. So let's get started. If you've been following along in parts 1 and 2, you'll have a similar application to what we're looking at now. If not, then I'll try and remember to put a link into the comments or the description so you can go and have a look at this on GitHub. But if you look, we have an application where we have a client side of it and a server side. And within the client side, we use create React app just to create a regular application. And then in our application, I just did the minimum to show you how to get information onto the screen. So we're using React hooks with the generated hook code based on the query that we defined in there. So we said we wanted to get to-dos, and we then got fetch that data, check to see if it's loading, check for errors, check for data. And then once we got all that, we put it onto the screen just like we would do any other data. So what we're going to do in this part, we're going to start off with breaking things up a little bit so we can get React router in, because we're going to need 2 screens. We're going to need a screen for the list and we're going to need a screen for the form. So the first thing we need to do is add React router. And also, whenever you're adding a library, you need to double check whether you need to add a type library associated with it. Make sure you do it from the client folder. It won't take long to do. And then what we're going to do is we need to set that up. And the way I'm going to break it up is I'm going to say my index file is where I sort out all my kind of integration code, and my my app is where I'm going to define how my application behaves. So in my in the top level, I just need to bring in React router. And I need to use a little bit of code just to wrap around my application to tell it it's now a rooted application. So how am I going to do that? I have my provider already. So I'm just going to wrap that. Okay, and then in my application, I've already got some code here, but I need to change that because I don't really want to have this in my app level. It's a page. So in my code, I'm creating a new folder called Pages, and this is my home page. And in there, I'll create something to hold that code. And the reason why I tend to create folders for creating pages is that or even components, is that they may need multiple files. I might want to add in test files. I might need to add in storybook files. So I like to create things in a folder. So I'm going to say import React from React. And I'm going to steal some. I'm basically going to copy this whole thing and use this. So my home page. I need to make sure I bring my imports, and this is going to change. It's now going to come from a few levels up. I think that's right. And export default home. That's no longer my application. I don't even need to put a class in there, really, do I? Well, yeah, let's leave that like that, and we're just going to say that. Okay, so I'm still putting in my to-do list. I'm just doing it in a separate place, and then back in my application, I'm going to need to import that. So import home from pages home. And I don't need this anymore. And I need to set up React Router to tell it that I want to go to the home page. So let's bring in React Router. We brought in our home page there. And let's set up a route to do this. And get rid of all this stuff I did before. And there we go. I've said now that I'm using a switch, which is just a component within the React Router library to let me define my routes, and it lets you do nested routes. So this is the first level of nesting and do multiple levels. So I'm going to say, okay, if whenever we go to the top level URL, I want to show the home page, and that should work. So let's see what happens. Yeah. So now it looks exactly the same. The difference is now that I'm rendering things from somewhere else. So I want to add a page for editing. So let's add that. So create new folder to do edit. And there again, I'll create an index file which defines what's going to happen in there. And bring in React. And we'll just put something in there to say what we're doing. Right, so simple page. I'm back in my application. I'm going to bring that page in now. Import my to-do edit page from pages to do edit. And I'm going to say whenever we go to a new URL, so let's go, I'm going to do this before, equals, so I'm going to say when a person goes to edit and then they provide an ID, then use my to edit component. The little bit here where it says ID, that is going to look in the URL for, basically use that part of the URL and then pass it in as a parameter into to do edit, and we'll see that in a minute. So we can't see this working yet because we haven't got any links. So let's turn that, let's modify the home page so that we want to use links in there. So React Router gives you a link component that you use instead of using hrefs. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to say, right, when I go to this, when I'm displaying title, I actually want to make this a link. So now it will go to /edit ID, like we defined up in the app there. And it should let us see the page, and it say it's worked. I hate this Google bug. Right. There. Can't see much, but that does the trick. One final thing is when we went into that page, as you saw, it used, we passed it an ID. So how do we get that ID? Because we're going to need that in a minute to get hold of our data. So one last thing I'm going to do in this part is I'm going to pull out the ID, and I need to tell it a little bit more here about what the parameters look like. So let me just set this up for you to do params. I'm going to define what my parameters are, and in this case I'm only interested in this. I'm only interested in an ID. And then I'm going to do something which is going to look ugly, but I'll explain what it is. So we're using TypeScript, so we can define our properties and things rather than using prop types. One predefined thing is ReactFC, which stands for React Functional Component. So we're saying here that this is a React functional component, and we're saying that within the first lot of brackets, you define what the properties are for that functional component. So we're taking it a little bit deeper here. We're saying actually the properties are actually going to come from a React Router component. So we're saying here that we get all the properties that a React component, a root component provides you, and that root component itself is expecting these params. This is about as complicated as it's going to get, so don't worry too much. It looks a little bit ugly, but it's just saying that the router has these parameters in it, and this is going to give us the autocomplete that we all want. So going back into my code, I'm going to put a fragment around this just to make things a little easier to manage. So I'm going to have the title, and how many brackets do I want? In that fragment, maybe I only need that, and I want to display on the screen the ID that we get. So how do I actually get hold of that information? If you look at the documentation for React Router, it gives you a whole bunch of things to help you out. In this case, we're going to pull out those things that we want. So within React Router, it always passes in a history property. It gives you a property called match, which is where your parameters actually sit. It's the match that it used to get to this page, and we'll pull that out from props. So I probably need to tell it that I'm using props there. So we've got a whole bunch of wavy lines. Not sure exactly why we got some of these, but we'll work it out in a second. All right, we haven't brought everything in that we need, so I need to import that. Starting to get a little bit happier. Let's go through and see anyway what it's complaining about, and then let's go through and see what we actually need, and then we can sort out the red wavy lines in a minute. That's because I'm not doing this. Right, so yeah, everything's gone nice and clean now. So I've had to bring in the definition there for this type or this interface. So I've said that I want to pull out the ID parameter from this match thing, and I'm now going to put it onto the screen. Hey presto, right. Let's see if that worked. And there we go, there's our ID. So as you can see, we've managed to use React Router to navigate to a placeholder page and extract the parameters that we need from that. The next step is we're going to go back to our form and figure out what we need to create. So let's get on with that. Okay, looking at the form, we've got a text field, a drop down, a checkbox, and a couple of buttons. We'll start by creating those as individual components, and then we'll bring them together using Formik, which is a form library that helps manage state and validation, all those sorts of things. So we'll assemble our form with those components inside Formik, and then we'll add the logic to go and get a to-do and handle saving a to-do. And I'm going to build all my components under a components folder. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create one for input. So the input is going to be just a regular text box that everyone's used to using. The difference is I'm going to create a component where you can call it and pass it the labels and values and everything you need to create that field, and it will do all the work. It will render that for you. But let me show you one I created earlier, as usual, and I'll talk you through what it's doing. So I'm saying when a person wants to create a text input, they need to pass it. Well, they're going to sometimes pass in the label. They must always pass in a name. They could optionally pass in the type, and the rest of the information I'm actually going to get from Formik. Formik's going to handle the store, so it's going to know what the value is for a field. It gives a key value per thing for it. So I'm going to have Formik handle that bit. So I've defined a simple interface for the properties that this function is expecting, and then I'm pulling those out. And then the main thing really is I'm just setting up the markup using the Bootstrap classes to put something on the screen. So all Bootstrap fields get wrapped in a form group. I'm then displaying the label. The actual field itself, I'm going to let Formik render that, because it's by giving it the name, it's going to know what the current value is, and it's going to add in all the things it needs for handling on change and on blur, etc. I've optionally allowed people to pass in a footnote. Make sure that's in there. Yep. I'm optionally letting people pass in a footnote, and I'm also saying that if there's an error, then I want to show that below the footnote, and it's using again another class that gets given to me by Formik, and Formik will do that, looking up for errors by name, so that it uses name as a key value per lookup. So I'm concentrating on the layout, and Formik is concentrating on state management and doing a little bit of the heavy lifting there for me. And that's all I need to do to create a input field. The next component I'm going to need is that dropdown. Selects are a little bit more complicated than text fields, in the fact that you have options and you have to mark which of those are active or not. Luckily, Formik understands this, and it lets you pass in those options as children of your field component, and it then figures out how to display those and how to manage which ones are active and which ones aren't, and when they change. So it's easiest to show it, really. So I'm going to add a new select component. And let me show you the markup that I've written. So it's slightly more complex in the interface definitions. So I said that, okay, select has options, and options are just a key value, and just a pair with a label and a value. And then the select props for this particular component, you can pass in whether it's disabled. Again, you can pass in a footnote, an optional label. The difference here is that you're passing in options that it wants to display. And remember, it handles what the value is. Formik's kind of doing that state management. So I pull out my props as usual. Just like the text field, we wrap everything in a form group and optionally show a label. And then just like the text input, we use a field component provided by Formik. The only difference here is that within that, we render a list of options. And all I'm doing is I'm just going through and creating regular markup to say the value for this option is value and the label is label. I'm just using value as a unique key because I'm mapping things and you have to use a key. That's it. It's not that much more difficult than text fields. Final thing I need to do is I need to create a checkbox. So, new folder for that, checkbox. And again, the checkbox is very similar to a text field. In fact, as you can see here, I even cut and paste the properties for that because I was too lazy to retype it. Here we go. So all the same properties as before. I'm not sure why I passed in type. Do I use type anywhere? No, so we can get rid of that. It literally was just a cut and paste exercise. The difference is just the markup. So again, form group, optional label, field. This time I'm just saying that it's a checkbox. I could maybe have used the input component here. I think the reason why I created the checkbox component is just because it's nice to have semantic markup in your code. So the next step is I'm going to create a form. I'll just create a regular HTML form to begin with, without any sort of bits wired up, just so I can show you what the components look like and give us something to start with and a page to work with. Also, I just added an extra file that, as I said, we created our components there. I just created an extra file just to wrap those up to make importing a little bit easier. As I said, we want to create a form. And what I do is I create forms in their own component. And that's because later on, it lets you reuse the form in multiple places. So in our case, we might want to reuse the form for adding and editing. There may be slightly different rules around how we're showing stuff for adding and editing. So it's nice to keep that form, just doing that one thing and trying to do it well. So I'm going to create a new place in my project just for forms. And I'm going to create a to-do form. And that's where I put the source for that. And as usual, I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to put in a little placeholder. And for now, I was going to put a placeholder in there. To show that we have a form. And I'm doing this just so we can actually build it into our page. So going back to the pages, in my to-do edit, I now want to bring in that form. So import to-do form from forms to do. And in my code, I'm going to say I want to have a to-do form. All right, we have our form. And in the form itself, I want to bring in some components to actually put into that form. So I'm going to, from my components folder, I'm going to bring in, what do we call them? We have checkbox, import and select. and now we can add those in. So I'm going to create an input. Not infinity. I want to create an input, which is going to be for a title. And I've said that I want to create a text input for a field named title, and I want to label it title. And that's all I need to do, because again, all the state management stuff is all done for me by Formik. I don't need to worry about that. The select today is going to be a little bit more tricky, so I will come back to that in a second. And I want to create a checkbox and some buttons. I said I'm not going to create button components right now. Normally I would, but as soon as I'm using let's change that. As soon as I'm using Bootstrap, I'm not going to worry about it too much. Ooh, it doesn't like something about this. Register field is not a function. Okay, it doesn't like the fact that we haven't got Formik set up. So tell you what, let's actually make this into a Formik field, a Formik form, and then it should all start to come to life a little bit better. So the difference is going to be now is I'm going to actually wrap this in my own Formik form. And Formik itself has its own form thingy component. Don't worry about these right now. I'm just going to put in placeholders. If we don't need initial values, I'm going to take out that. It should be okay without those. Let's see if it complains a little bit less. No, it's not happy about that. This is where the autocomplete is helping us, and it's saying it's not happy about some of the things that are in there. It's missing the following properties from type. I think it's not happy about on render, to be honest, on submit. So let's again go back and do what we did before. Console log submit. It's not happy about something else. Initial values equals that. Non-empty expression. We're going to say title is start. Then we'll give it something to work with. No, I'm still not happy. Can't find title. Okay, bear with me for a second. I'm going to try and figure out why it's not happy. Okay, did a little bit of digging around, and what I've decided to do is make it a little bit more realistic, and that's going to help actually make things work. So for now, I've created that fake to do, and I set my initial values to that fake to do, and I'm going to also put the onSubmit in here as well, actually. So const onSubmit equals, and when a form submits, it normally submits some data. And actually we can start typing some of this stuff because we know what a to-do looks like. So we're going to say import the to-do type definition, because we are using to-dos from our GraphQL generated stuff. So we can say there that a to-do is a to-do. And it's when you start complaining about things because something's missing. It wants an ID. Yep, so I'm starting to get type checking in there. Complete is missing as well. See, if I hadn't brought in that type, I would have forgotten about this. So we have a fake to do now, and we know that it's a to do. We also know that the form itself, when it submits, it's going to submit a to do back into that. So on submit, we're going to get form data, which is going to be a to do, because we know that the initial value for this form is to do, and it's going to keep maintaining that state. And so because it's maintaining that same object, it's going to send me back a to do. So I know it's going to be to do. So because I know that, I can do console log form data dot, and it knows it's got a title. Gotta love TypeScript. Okay, so we got our unsubmit. And we've got a fake to do. So we set up our form. And it's still not happy. No unused expressions. Line 22. Doesn't like that, which is very strange. Okay, right, so yeah, of course we just want to say on submit. Right. Hey, look, we've got a form. It's not a particularly stylish form, and for some reason it hasn't brought in the button styles that I wanted. So I probably didn't put in the stuff for Bootstrap. So let's change that before I forget. So yeah, back in my top level kind of index file that it gets created for me, I need to go and get the Bootstrap URL. So let's fix that, shall we? Where should we put it? Let's just put it here. There we go. Bootstrap styles. I'm not going to get all the styles right within this example that I'm showing you. I'm sure that you know how to do that, so I'll let you do that yourself. So we're going to create the form. We're going to get it all wired up. We're going to need to pull in a to-do, and we're also going to need to get a list of projects to use for that projects dropdown. Now, one thing I realized is that when we created our server originally, we didn't actually create the query for projects to get a list, and also I need to create the queries on the client side as well. So let's start by doing that. So going back to our server, if you go back into schema, as I said, we defined some queries. We had to-dos and to-do, so within our form we're going to be able to pull in an individual to-do, but I didn't create a projects query, so let's create that. So I will say projects is simply a list of projects, and I need to create a query to do it. So projects, and it's going to be the same as to do, really. It's just the only difference it's going to be is it's going to pull it from a different table. So let's do that. So projects, and we can't forget to export it. Now we got our projects in there, and we're going to set up. So I should be able to go back to my query, and I tried this a minute ago and it didn't work, so let's try again. Projects does not exist. It doesn't like the projects table. Oh, right, we must have called it something else. We must have called it project. Let's try again. There we go. Right, so we now have a thing that will give us a list of projects. And back in the client, I need to define the GraphQL queries that this page is going to use. So I have a to-do query that I just defined, which is a query that's going to use a parameter to pull back an individual to do, and that will go up to the server and it will get that. So if actually we go back to the server again, if you look into my resolvers, you'll see I have, sorry, into my queries, you'll see I've got a to do, and it gets that to do and finds it. I need one for projects as well. So new file, I want to call it project list, to follow the same naming convention I use for to do. And so I'm just going to cut and paste it for a second, but I don't really need to. Actually, let's go back to here. What did we do? We did this. So I can just pull it in and call it project list. And that should do it. So let's have a look and see. Yeah, we generated things, select is defined, never used. That's okay, we're fine. It's rebuilt our GraphQL stuff, so we should be good. So we now have GraphQL set up. So we'll get a to-do, it'll get projects, and I'm going to use those within my form. So that's the next step. So going back to my to-do edit page, as you saw, we passed in an ID for the to-do that we're working on. So I want to go and get that to-do and pass it into the form. Have I used any GraphQL stuff in here yet? No, I haven't. So I've got my form, but I need to bring it in some stuff from the GraphQL queries that are being generated. So from GraphQL, I want to bring, I know what a to-do is. Do I need to know to-do? I don't know. I want the projects. No, I'll get that and everything. So use to-do query. I'm going to get the to-do. I've got the ID. And I'm going to use that query that we created to get the to-do. So I'm going to use the hook that's been generated for me by that library. And into that I'm passing the object, because I can pass in all sorts of different things into the hooks, and you need to look at the documentation to find out which ones, because you use different ones for different situations. In this instance, I had a query to get to do, and within that, I'm going to pass in to say that I'm going to use the ID. So if we look back at the query, what we got to do, I'm saying in my query definition, I have a property called ID, which is of type ID. And then I'm saying here, I'm passing some variables into this query, so I'm passing in ID. So it will use that ID in my query. And again, it comes back with data error and loading, and I already have created code before to handle those, so I'm just going to cut and paste that in, which is says if it's loading, say loading, if there's an error, say error, and if it's okay, then we continue. So now I've loaded up my to-do to put into the form. I need to put it into the form. So if we look at our form, we haven't told it to expect anything yet. So let's go find the form. So I'm going to say in my form that I want to be able to pass in a to-do into it that I'm going to be editing. So let's set up some properties, shall we? Because at the moment we've just said, yeah, we just said it's that. We just said it's a straightforward component with no properties, but we're now going to say that actually we do have some properties that we want to be able to pass in a to-do of type to-do. And I think we already got that in there. Yes, we've already included that in there, so we're good. And now it needs to expect that. It needs to expect those properties to come in. So it always has to pass in a to-do. So we can get rid of this, because we can say const to-do equals props. We're going to pull it out of props. No wavy lines, so it must be happy. So now we've passed in the to-do into our form. Let's see what happens. Oh, it doesn't like something. Oh yeah, I haven't actually told it to pass it through. Okay, so going back to the form, we now do have a wavy line because it's saying, well, actually, you're supposed to be passing something into me. So we're going to pass in to do. Yep, and it knows that that's a to-do. Right, should be a little bit happier. And there we go. We have a form that's passing the value. So we created we got the to-do out of the database. We passed it into the form. The form brought it in as a property, and we said, right, we want to create a form, and its initial values to start with are the to-do that we pass in, and then after that, it will then change those, and when we submit, it's going to give us the changed to do. So actually see what happens when we do that. So if I go back and change the title, what happens? It works. It passes that in. It's called so when it's submitted the form, it's called unsubmit with the data from the form, and we can then pull out that data and actually use it. So that's great. We now have a form that we can do things with. Now we want to go and sort out that select that we left out before. So I'm going to do that within the form because it's common to whether you add things or edit things. It doesn't make any difference. So let me go and figure out how I'm going to do that. I'm going to pull it in from GraphQL. So I need to use the project list query. So I need to use project list query. There you go, autocomplete, love it. And I also want project. I want the type for that. Here we go. And I want to pull in those stuff. So again, it's almost cut and paste. I could probably in fact, I will kind of at some point refactor my application so that you can define common code that gets hoisted up for handling loading and errors. But for now, I'm just going to use my usual stuff. Right, yeah. So what do? I need to map it. So it comes back in a particular format. So it comes back in the format that we saw in that query. So it comes back with an ID and title. But for select components, we said we want to use value and label. So I wrote a little bit of transformation code that does that. And I've defined an option. What was option? Yeah. So option within the select component, we said that you had to give it an array of options. So rather than me redefine that, I can pull in that type definition. So okay, the project to option function. The idea is that it takes a project and it returns an option, and it's just a transformer. That's all it is. So through type checking, I know that the thing I'm returning is the right format, and I know the format of the stuff that's coming into it. And so it's just a really simple function there to do that. So I now have project options, and I'm going to add a select that uses those. So where shall I put that? Above the checkbox? Yeah, above the checkbox. So we've got a field that's called, and this is the thing, you can nest field names. So in here, I'm saying, it's saying to do a property on the do object called project.id. And the reason why I'm using the nest in here is because that's what comes back from the query. See, project ID. So that maps here to project ID. You can do nesting when you save things as well, and we'll get to that in a minute. It's up to you whether you flatten things or whether you nest them. There's pros and cons to the different choices you make. It's going to give it a pretty label, and we're passing in options because that's one of the things that's required by the component. So when we pass in options, they get rendered into option tags there. So we now have a select field that says what the project is. And hey presto, it worked. Good, eh? So we now have a field that has been populated with my to-do. I've got the options available, and I'm calling onSubmit when I'm done. So the last bit is I actually want to save it. So let's move on to that. So we want to save the data from the form. But there's one quick gotcha I want to talk about before we actually go and do that. When the data comes down and gets put into the form, there's a hidden field that Apollo brings down as well and populates in that object, which is _type name. That helps it in caching things, and it helps it know kind of what types of things it's dealing with. But on the downside, it gives us a bit of a problem in the fact that when we go and save something, we actually tend to use a different type, or at least I know that the auto-generated code here definitely does use a different type. And it's also not expecting that type name field. It's good practice when you save a form to sanity check the data that you're getting from that form. This stops people adding in extra fields themselves. It takes away any extra hidden fields that you may have in there for other stuff. It just basically it's just sanity checks and cleanses the data to make sure that everything's as you'd expect. If we look through the application we got at the moment, I want to show you what I mean by this extra field. So if we drill down into the form, and we've got our to-do form there, let's get down and to find the data. Value, values. Right, this is see what I mean. You have, these are the values that have been put into the form through that initial values attribute that we populated. As you can see, you've got the complete and ID and project. These are all the things that you expected, but you didn't expect this type name field, and it will break things if you then try and save using type name, because it's also going to try and put in its own type name within the Apollo code when it's saving stuff. So let's show you what I mean. What I'm going to do is, when you post the form, you want to make sure that you pass that data. So let's do that. And to be honest, that job does not belong in the form itself. The form should just be responsible for rendering and just for rendering stuff to the screen, and also pulling in things it needs for things like the drop-down fields. But it shouldn't handle any business logic. And in this case, adding a to-do may be different to editing a to-do. So that's why we created a generic form to do that, but we moved the logic to get the to-do somewhere else. So if we go back into our form, you can see we've got props saying the to-do. I also want to tell it to expect an on submit, and also let's do the same thing for on cancel as well. So going to my types, I want to say this form needs somebody to tell it what to do when you cancel and submit, because you may want to go somewhere different when you cancel. So it's always going to, I'm saying we're going to pass in a to do. Sorry, the on submit function will expect a to do. So we've got rid of this, we got rid of that, and we're just going to say on cancel and on submit. We're going to bring those out from props, and in the page we should now find that it's not happy. Yep, which is good. I expected that. So I want to have, I only want to define these when I've actually got some data. So let's do it below the hooks. So on submit, and I had to do a little bit of digging here to actually find out what the typing was for this. And there may be types that are defined within the library already, but I wasn't totally sure. But this is the best I came up with. Was, I'm going to say that the onSubmit function, it's an asynchronous function because I want to be able to do some asynchronous actions and wait for them to complete. And from what I understand, it's also expecting a promise back, even though that promise is not going to do anything. It just wants a promise to say, hey, I'm done, because it's an async function. I'm going to pass in that, so it's going to be getting a to do. So let's go back to here and bring in the to do type. So this is the function that is going to get called when we submit the form. And we also need to do a cancel one, and I'll do the signature for the cancel one, then we'll actually do the work for it. On cancel equals, let's just put a placeholder in for now. If you don't put the spaces in, it doesn't do the autocomplete. Here we go. Right, so it's happier. The wavy red lines are gone. So what is submit going to do? It's going to need to call. It's going to need to cleanse the data, and then it's going to call a mutation. We don't have the mutation, so we've got all this ready and waiting. Let's go and write the mutation. And before I do that, I'm going to look at my schema to understand what parameters and things it needs. And looking at the definition here, I see actually it's expecting a title, but it doesn't expect project. So let's update that a little bit because that must be an old version. I want to pass in a project ID, and that's going to be a string. So project ID, and so this is where you could use nested. I could create a new type here to say when I add a to-do, use an add to-do input type, and go and look at the GraphQL stuff for input types, and that input type would describe a nested object. But for today, just to keep this simple, I'm going to do a flat mutation, just so I don't need to go and add new types, that's all. But if I was doing it myself, I'd probably be tempted to actually go and create that new input type. And I'm going to say it's optional. You don't need to assign a project. And again, and it's the same down here as well for update or to do. You could, but you don't have to. If I look at my mutations, add to do just spreads the args, so I don't need to change my query at all there. And it's the same, we're doing the same thing, we're doing a wait there, update. I don't even need to spread it there. So I don't need to change any of my database work, I just needed to change that in the query, and the mutation definition. So back in my project, let's create a mutation for add to do, shall we? Yep. And I've looked at the definitions there within the schema, and I've decided I brought one I created earlier as usual. So as I said, it's expecting a title and a project. So I pass those through, and I want back basically all the details about the to do. I might use those. I'm actually probably going to throw these away, but for now I'm just saying always return back the whole object, because I can now get hold of the ID and stuff like that. So I've added the to do mutation. I don't need to do anything there because it gets auto generated. Yeah, and there's the only warnings about that on cancel. That's not doing anything, so that's good. So when I go back to my page, and I look at my on submit, I can now use that new mutation. So I got a new bit of code that I can use, right, and that will actually do the saving. So now, in my on submit, I could, as I said, if I just went ahead and just went and saved that, then it's going to complain because of the types and things that are associated with it. But I'm actually going to transform it. I'm going to have it so I actually create that clean object. So what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to create, so I'm going to pass in this thing called variables, as we saw before. So I'll show you what I'm going to, what the call I'm going to make, and then we can populate them when it needs. So I'm going to call the update to do mutation. When we do a query to get hold of something, we pass it in as variables, and it's the same thing for when you're mutating. And at the end of that, I'm going to actually send us back to the home page. So this variables thing is just going to be my cleansed data. So update me to, yep, I need to bring a new type. So I need to bring update to do mutation variables. What was it called again? Update mutation variables. They must have changed it in a recent version, so let's see what we've got. Mutation add to do args. Yeah, sounds about right. Let's go for that. Mutation add to do args. Yeah, well, it's not expecting oh, we're doing an edit, we're not doing an add. That's why it's complaining about that. Okay, let's go back and let's do another mutation, shall we? We'll add a new one for edit. Edit to do GraphQL. I mean, it's all the same thing, really. So it was just the same as the add one, just with a couple more variables. I forgot we were doing edits instead of adds. So mutate. So I want to add, yeah, update to mutation. Let's go back and have a look what we've been in there. So use update to do mutation, and then mutation update to do mutation update to do args. Let's try it. See what happens. Update to do mutation. Right, okay, so after a bit of messing around and getting mixed up between add and edit, we have an update query which generates a update mutation for us. We've got the argument type already defined, so I know that I can pass in ID, title, project, and complete. And I've then said, right, create me a variables object, which has to be the correct type for this. And then from the form data, I'm pulling out these things. You could probably use Lodash as well to make this a little bit neater in bringing out those fields. But there you go. And the last thing is I'm trying to push. And the reason why it's saying that it's complaining there is because I haven't told it anything about history. So history is a thing that's on the React router property that gets sent in. So I now can go and push it back to the home page. So I clean my data, I wait for it to save, and then when it's done, I push them back to the home page. I could wait and look at the data that comes back from this and then go to a details page. That would be particularly useful when I'm adding stuff. But for now, I'm keeping it simple and I'm just saving it and I'm just hoping it all works. There's no error checking, there's no validation here, it just works. Get rid of that, don't need it. So, is it going to complain about this? Yep, not happy, which is neither a React function component or a custom hook. Let's try and find out why. On submit is a function. I told it to do this and do that. Right, okay, well let's do a little bit of digging and try and find out why it's not happy. I just realized what I'm doing wrong. With the mutation, I have to create a hook and then call it, and here I'm doing that wrong. So back up at the top, and you can't have hooks be conditional, so I need to make sure I do this at the top. We've created a call there to get it to do, and before that I need to create the hook for the update. So it can't be conditional, so I can't wait until I've definitely got some data before I create it, so I need to always have that mutation. And then I use the mutation. Right, here we go. So change the thing, project, complete, change the thing. So it's saved. Back again, it's saved it back into the database. So we're going to add validation to our form to finish it off. I'm going to use a framework called Yup. Yup works really well with Formik. It lets you describe your validation in a schema, and then you just pass it to Formik, and it applies that. There are other libraries, but Formik seems to favor Yup, and it works perfectly well. And the validation itself belongs in the form, not in the page, because I want to have clean data sent back to the page for it to save. So I'm going to add the dependencies to the project. Now, one thing that's slightly strange is that when I've tried this before, I've added Yup to the project that way, but then when I've tried to use it, it said it couldn't be found. So I've added it to the dependencies, but then I also need to go to the top level of the project and make sure that it installs it. I don't know why it behaves like that, it just does. And at least it's installed at this time. When I tried it previously, it just said it wasn't found. So yarn dev to get things started. And so you had the wavy line there because I tried it a few minutes ago and it didn't work. So import Yup as Yup. And then we're going to create our validation schema. So validation schema equals Yup dot, and it has a slightly strange syntax for doing this. I don't know why it does it, but anyway. Object dot shape. It's kind of reminds me a lot of prop types. And we want to say we've got a field called title, and title we'll use a Yup string validator, and we're going to say it's required. And you can optionally put a message in there if you want. As you see, you've got autocomplete, so you can put an optional message in. So, hey, why didn't I enter a title? And never used validation schema on cancel, never used. Okay, well, let's go and fix some of these errors. So we're now going to say on the form, we've got a validation schema. Validation schema, there we go. And what do we call it? Validation schema. Yeah. So we now have a validation schema. Also, we're not using on cancel. Well, we don't need on cancel, we need it on the button. So button class name, blah blah blah. And there should be an on click or something in there to handle that. Yeah. We need to make sure that you cancel things. Alright, so we can stop complaining about that. Yep. Defined but never used. Well, I'll figure that one out in a minute. Index.tsx. Alright, we never used it, so why have we got it? Right, so our page is happy. Let's go back and look at the browser. If I can find it. So try and save, and nothing. Well, it was worth a try, wasn't it? Right, I've done some investigation to try and find out why. When I kind of try to save my form with no details in the title, why it doesn't give me an error message. And it's actually highlighted a really interesting thing. If you look on the screen, you can't see an error. But if you look in the markup, you can see one. And what happens is this is actually a feature of Bootstrap. Bootstrap won't show the error unless you say that something is inactive. Inactive? Yeah, come on, it's got to say that. It's invalid, sorry. So I've said that this field's invalid, and instantly the CSS rule gets picked up from Bootstrap to say, right, okay, no, you can display an error message. So the idea is it's trying to hide error messages until the field is marked to say. The issue here is that in my code, if you look at the components that we were building for fields, so with this one, I would have to say is invalid. But how would I do that? Because if you look at the properties, there's nothing in the properties to tell me that it's invalid. there's no way of me knowing within here that this is an invalid field because I'm just rendering something blind. So there are a few different ways we can tackle this. You could use a higher order component that Formik comes with, which is with Formik, and that would insert the field and form details into this component, and it would let you then get access to say, all right, does this field have an error? Yes, okay, then show that. But it's fighting against the framework a little bit. There's another alternative, which is in Formik version 2, you will have use Formik, and that will do the same things as the higher order component. It'll let you bring in the form details into the component out of the context and get access to that to see if something's an error. But if you look at the Formik documentation, they talk about a different way, a slightly different approach that I didn't want to take, but it looks like it's the best way to do it after all. And that is, if you looked in the form, you'd see that I wanted to keep things semantic. I wanted to say that I've got an input and a select and a checkbox, and I wanted to keep it so it was really easy to read. The downside there is that that's not how Formik want you to do it. They want you to do a different approach. They want you to say that something is a field, and then to pass in a component type for that. So I'd say component equals input. And they want you to use that method. And the idea being that you take care of all the rendering. So if we look at the input, what I would then have to create was I'd have to create a slightly more complex input. Let's talk about the types briefly. Whenever you, in all the Formik fields, a Formik field is always called with field props as minimum. So that's things like field and form. But then in my custom field, I want to be able to pass in the label and the type and a couple of other bits and pieces. So I have to extend the Formik field and add my own properties. And then instead of handing over the rendering to Formik for an input, I have to render it myself. But it's still not too difficult because I pass in a field object that Formik gives me, and that's got all the handlers and the values and everything else, and the name even. I just literally just put that in, and then to that I add my custom types. So because I now have access to more form information, I can find out if this field has been touched and if the form contains an error for that field. So I now have the ability to set the class, but I also have to render errors myself manually as well. It's not much more work. It's literally just 2 or 3 more lines, but the downside is that I don't get that readability that I wanted in my form. But this is the trade-off that you get. You get a more flexible form. So actually going forward, I'll probably switch my style to use the field method, so I've got access to more of the form. So that's the only thing. Just watch out for that. I hope that you've stayed on to the end to be able to see this. But with that, we now have a working form. So you can list to-dos, you can click into one to edit it, you can save the changes, and it'll use a mutation back on the GraphQL server to save it. So it's done. If you have any ideas for how you'd want to take this forward, if you've got any things you want me to explore more, please let me know. So if you'd like me to make a video on how to use Storybook with this setup, or how to integrate Jest, any of those sorts of subjects, where linting, then just leave me a comment below, and the ones that people want the most, then I'll start making those as well. But I hope you've enjoyed it. I know it's been a long one, but I hope it was worth it. Thank you for sticking around. Bye.